As many of you know, the Contemporary Talk series is sponsored by Louis Corrigan and Possible Futures, which is always very generous on his part to help us bring acclaimed artists and architects and curators and dealers to Atlanta to talk a little bit about their work and what drives them, some of their experiences. And I have been wanting to invite Deborah Kass to come and talk with us about a range of work that she's done over the years. I would typically start this kind of conversation in the way that most of these things are done, which is by establishing some kind of level of seriousness, right? Which is always.
You sure you want to go down that?
Well, I mean, that's what winds up happening, which is that, you know, people like me wind up saying Deborah Kass has work in the collection of the Museum of Modern Art.
Oh, I think you should say
and
that.
The Guggenheim and the National Portrait Gallery in the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. And she is the senior critic at the graduate painting program at Yale University. And she's been in a bunch of significant exhibitions, the names of which I think might be helpful for everybody. If you're not familiar with Deborah's work, this might give you a little bit of insight. Titles of some of the exhibitions that she has been in. The Decorative Impulse at the Neuberger Museum at Purchase, New York.
Hold on. The Deconstructive Impulse.
The Deconstructive Impulse. What did I say?
The Decorative Impulse.
I said the decorative?
Right?
Interesting. We'll come back.
Fascinating.
We'll come back around to that. I would say that was like, is she paying attention? But clearly she is.
You're talking about me.
That's right. Okay. Feel-good paintings for feel-bad times. And more feel-good paintings for feel-bad times at Paul Kasman Gallery in New York, which is where Deborah shows. Shifting the Gaze, Painting and Feminism at the Jewish Museum in New York. The Andy Warhol Museum, which we'll talk about a little bit later, in Pittsburgh, which is a place that Deborah has a very significant relationship to, presented her mid-career survey called Before and Happily Ever After, and a show that I thought was quite terrific at the Metropolitan Museum of Art regarding Warhol's 60 Artists, 50 Years. So not just the seriousness of the institutions that own the work and many of the places that have presented the work, that's always the sort of thing which is supposed to develop your oh my godness in relationship to the speaker. But what's really fun and more significant, I think we want to talk a lot about today, is the nature of making the work, the nature of why one makes work, using various historical figures, various historical material, playing with art history, playing with pop culture. And what we thought would be a way of introducing this to you is to literally just go through some imagery and then talk. So here we go.
So you should check out the dates so you know we're talking about work that was a long time ago. Except my head's right in the way, isn't it?
Yes. No.
Okay.
You don't even have to scooch down, as they say, or any of that. So we're starting in 1992, and I think we're already establishing that Deb's work connects to an impulse that comes out of a period most often associated with a generation of artists who have taken upon themselves to appropriate pre-existing imagery. So we're going to see already a range of material, whether it's Cézanne still lives, or David Salle paintings, or comic imagery, a sense of poaching on predecessors or peers, right? I always think for somebody, as it will become a little bit obvious maybe later, a language lover, it's always intriguing to look at titles. You have some great titles in your work over the years.
Thank you.
My Spanish Spring.
See, this one's completely out of focus. I didn't know that. But it's called How Do I Look? Let's go through, go. I can't stand looking at it.
And it's the critic sees, right? It's the Jesper Johnson.
That's the critic sees, Picasso's, Gertrude Stein, and Courbet's Sleepers.
Right.
Fuzzy.
Okay, Warhol's Dance Steps.
Making Men, number 4.
Okay, so who in the room has had a nose job? Anybody? Okay, just curious.
Who's not admitting it?
Right, quick, we can fool you. before and happily ever after. All right, so let's stop now on gold Barbara for a second, unless you want to just literally go through all of these.
Whatever you
Is
want.
the idea that they are behind you in some incapacitated state going to bug you?
Not at all.
Okay.
Oh, well, yeah, let me apologize. I hate PowerPoint. All the color's terrible. Go on.
Okay. All right, so let's just look
The
at
color's
some imagery
dreadful.
here.
These are as pop and as clean color as this right out of the tube cadmium red light, which you would never know from this, but it's really, every color's off. And if you can imagine all these things in the clearest, most advertising type color, it's what they are.
Okay, so
Yeah.
let's stop here for a minute and see if the people here can focus on you and what you're saying rather than imagery. And we'll continue with imagery in a little while, if that's cool.
So you want to go up to here?
Let's go up to here.
Fine.
So what we've already seen is a range of work that has you assembling, constructing imagery, using silkscreen, using, in some cases, the way that the thing you're poaching is made, you're using that same production method. So early 90s, how do you come to start making work like this? You're in New York, who are you around, who are you talking to, what's happening?
Well, the best way to describe, let's go back just so we know what we're talking about.
Okay.
Because those paintings, first paintings I call the art history paintings, they have to do with post-war painting. And yeah, so just to go back, that's fine. Just
Okay.
go back to that one. That's a good one.
I'm sorry. Yep. Okay.
But when he flicks like that, you can see how I got from that to Barbra Streisand. So, but anyway, I was reading a lot of, there were several things that became known as cultural studies that at the time were different, were things like feminist literary criticism, critical race theory, and I'm leaving one out, there's always three. Critical race theory, feminist literary criticism, not art history, because nobody was really doing this.
Gender, queer theory.
Queer theory was just starting, but it was all multiculturalism. It was the beginning of multiculturalism. It was when it was really happening and really hot. And there were several threads that were going through other disciplines that I thought needed to go through painting in particular, not photography, although I was extremely influenced by Barbara Kruger and Sherry Levine and Cindy Sherman. So I should actually start with that. My big influences were when I was in my 20s, in the 70s, were Elizabeth Murray, Mary Heilman, Pat Steer. Those were my painting goddesses. And their work was all over the place in New York in the 70s, before the art market really shifted into the high gear that the 80s was. The 80s were. In the 80s, it was the work of Barbara Kruger, Sherry Levine, and Cindy Sherman, all of those three in particular, that was really critical work, that was actually talking about media, talking about images, and deconstructing them in a way through a feminist lens. There was nobody doing anything like this in painting. At the same time, feminist literary criticism, which was really the foundation of women's studies. Women's studies didn't exist yet. Black studies was just starting, but women's studies came out of a bunch of really nerdy, smart girls who, 10 and 15 years older than me, who had gone to Barnard in Columbia and really important, Radcliffe, and they were good girls who really loved French literature and really loved English literature, but somehow feminism happened, and they started to reconsider the canon through this feminist lens. And I thought, no one's really dealt with painting this way. These women are dealing, Sherry, Barbara, and Cindy, with power structures, Barbara, film, Cindy, and Sherry Levine was sort of touching on a lot of stuff, but being very, I would say, Apollonian about it, like very austere. And she used to say things like, I'm appropriating male desire. And all I wanted to ever say was, desire for what? And really what she was appropriating was male's desire for history and greatness and a place in all of that. And as a painter, which was very sort of off limits to women of my generation being the Neo-Expressionists and the Neo-Geo. These were all men. So all through the 80s, the big hot painters were only men. There was literally no woman of my generation got any attention. And at the same time, we used to call them the photo girls, were getting all this attention. And I was really interested in bringing that kind of discourse, the feminist sort of literary history, literary criticism people, people who are dealing with race like Michelle Wallace and Bell Hooks, but also in law, Patricia Williams, Derek Bell, and bringing that kind of analysis into the history of painting. So I very literally just did this. And I talked about the history of painting in my painting, and particularly post-war New York painting, because I'm a completely provincial person from New York, and it's all I really think about is like New York stuff. I think, there's Hollywood and New York to me. That's it. Sorry, Atlanta. I know there's good food other places, but for me, it's like the nexus of all meaning is New York and LA, because it's popular culture. Now, all of this stuff mushed together became what was called, Stuart Hall cultural studies. And then other things words came in like intertextuality. At the time I was doing this, I don't think intertextuality happened yet. But that's what this stuff is. It's saying, here's a little post-war painting, here's a little popular culture, here's a little French painting from the 19th century, and let's just put it all together and see what it means. And I was really talking about how power was inscribed within the discourse of painting, which is just what these people did in the law, they did in literature, and it's what I wanted to see in painting. That was very, it's exactly what I did, it's what I wanted to do, and that's that. That was a good sort of description of this?
Yeah.
Good.
Now, if you say that you're doing a little of this, a little of that, and a little of the other thing, using art history and pop culture as the places where you find those things, maybe you can talk a little bit about what does it mean when you're doing that, as opposed to what does it mean when David Salle is doing that?
Okay, well,
now the sources are
this is a good one to talk about
right.
this with. Well, if you just go back a couple, just because I was always kind of splitting things in threes, and I was definitely dealing with David Salle in my head a lot.
More?
No, well, this one would have been good, but it's so
Okay,
high
so
focus.
that's good.
But in this one, perfect example, Making Men #3. So I'm looking, this is a Jasper Johns element, right? The ruler, measuring a Robert Motherwell Dick, and an image from a wrestling instructional manual. So it's about how you become a man. How you become a man in painting, how you become a man in America, how you become a man, instructions. So let's go forward to before, that's another good one. This is like, I think, is this the first time I used Andy? Might have been the first time I used Andy Warhol, I'm not sure. I can't remember, but Andy's in the mix, definitely is post-war painting. And here, same deal, same book, with the instruction, this is how you dance, this is how you wrestle, and this is how you paint if you're letting it rip and you're Jackson Pollock. So I use Jackson Pollock a lot. I use Andy a lot. I use several, there are, repeating people I love, and they're really because I'm in love with them. So it's not just critical, it's really a lot of love in this, like love, hero love.
Which is a distinct difference than what anyone might have said about Sally, including Sally about Sally.
I'm not going to talk for David Salle.
Okay.
Does anyone care?
I don't want to put you in the position to do that.
Does anyone care about David Salle anymore?
No, so we're going to
Okay.
move away from David Salle.
Okay, let's go back to that one. So, because this was an important one.
The one before? Or the-
Yeah, Before and Happily Ever After. Okay, so this was a good one because I named I think it's so good I named my retrospective after it, which is Before and Happily Ever After. And that, of course, this was an image one saw in the newspaper in the 60s growing up. And in the 70s, well, and of course everybody knows the Disney moment where the princess gets her slipper. So there was also a book in the 70s called The Cinderella Complex that was a big crossover feminist book by Colette Dowling. And it was one of the feminist books that made it to the, because it was really hit a lot of notes, and it was about growing up as a woman, and it was what you think it's about, the Cinderella Complex. So I made this painting, and I thought I was making my usual feminist painting. But once I made the painting, I was like, oh my God, I just made a Jewish painting. And I didn't really think I was making a Jewish painting, but suddenly the Jewish princess thing came up. The nose job thing was like a duh, because I grew up on Long Island, like home of the nose job. And, my mother wanted me to get a nose job. I was just chubby. There's nothing wrong with my nose. It was just a cure-all. So this sort of extended what I was talking about into another realm that I hadn't planned on, that had to do with ethnicity.
Yeah, and the couple of paintings that we've just are looking at are paintings in a sense that are about how to become oneself, right? On some level.
Well, actually,
what are the models for being?
What I was interested in most of these paintings was my absence in art history. And this is the first one where my presence happened by mistake.
Okay.
I also got really tired of talking about my absence because, I'm absent in art history. Right?
You talking about your own absence, or like the Linda Nochlin, Where Are the Women absence?
The Linda Nochlin,
Okay.
which happens to include me being a woman.
Yes, gotcha.
Or as Serena said on Veep, as a woman, and I am a woman. just on Sunday night. So this was sort of, suddenly I was in a painting, even though I didn't have a nose job, but like people I knew did, and this was my first inkling of, my presence might be more interesting than my absence. And it was a little victim-y. I couldn't kind of deal with the victim thing anymore. So this led to, where is my presence? Flip to Barbara.
Right, but were you also thinking about Warhol as a person who had some of that same presence, absence about his own personality or his own sense of self?
All of that happened with the Warhol stuff.
Okay.
So now we're going to go to the next one. So you can see where that led. It took a year, but it led pretty directly to this, which is, going from my absence, I just sort of made a picture of people I know in this nose job painting, which led to my wondering about my presence and where had I ever seen my presence and where had I ever really felt my presence in popular culture. Now, I loved the movies, and I was very involved with my parents' cultural references, and my mother was like a movie fanatic, and my father was a jazz fanatic, so really everything, and my mother was also very political. So every sort of thing I do is somehow orbits around these three things. But when, I grew up, there was the Saturday Night at the Movies on NBC. And they always had, for instance, Gentlemen Prefer Blondes. And I loved Marilyn Monroe, but I knew I was no Marilyn Monroe. I might have been a Jane Russell, but I was not a Marilyn Monroe. So when Barbra Streisand hit the scene, and I was 12 years old, I was also I was a little large culture vulture, and I spent a lot of time reading the arts and leisure section of the New York Times on Sundays at my parents' house. So 12, 13, maybe 13, when I really became aware of Barbra Streisand, I had never gone to a Broadway show. I wasn't going to go to a Broadway show, and I sort of missed her in Funny Girl, I think. Anyway, if I had demanded someone please take me to this, to meet, to see this creature who looks like everyone I know for once, who's a superstar. So anyway, here was Barbara, who really became my absolute role model as a child. She still is. And it was the fact that I finally saw something in culture I could identify with. And I didn't really know I was missing it till I saw this Punim, this Shana Punim. This was like a beautiful thing to me, to actually see a superstar who was anything like anyone I knew, and that meant that I could be one.
Right, who also negotiating some of the same set of conundrums.
But I didn't know that.
Right, but
I just went,
Right.
she can do it, I can do it.
Right. Now, let me, I just want to not miss the opportunity to ask you, if your dad was your dad was a dentist, but your dad also was a jazz lover, so in a household with a jazz lover, would you have already kind of intuited a relationship to the idea of theme and variation? Would that have come?
Absolutely, without a question, and I always do say that. And I actually didn't put this together till I had a big show in New Orleans, and I had to give a talk. It was the Warhol Project show,
Right.
the first big show I ever had. That was a sort of, it was just on this work called the Warhol Project. And I didn't realize it till I gave my little spiel to the trustees at Tulane, that I was in New Orleans, that this was the birth of, I mean, I grew up. Do you know what it means to miss New Orleans? I grew up with these guys and these women. I mean, Sarah Vaughan and Billie Holiday and Ella. These were the only idea of great art in my living room were jazz artists. Mm-hmm. The only thing I understood as greatness was Dizzy Gillespie and Monk, and it was all about themes and variations. So when I got into this Warhol stuff, and I had to give this talk at Tulane, and I was looking at 8 years of Warhol work at that time, or 7, it really blew my mind that in 7 years it never occurred to me that I was making pop standards my way. Mm-hmm. And that's exactly what, of course, jazz is. So yes, but I didn't know I would, it's one of those duh moments.
Right, right.
As someone who's brought up listening to the way Monk plays something or Miles plays it, and then how Sarah Vaughan sings it, or Billie Holiday sings it, and that everybody has the same melody and everyone does it a completely different way. So this is exactly what I did with Andy Warhol. Mm-hmm. Cluelessly, 7 years into it, I figured it out. So yeah. So, let's flip through some more. So the first show of this stuff was this Barbra in her magnificent nosiness, her profile, her difference, being, on display and glamorized. And of course, she was in complete charge of her representation more than any other female star ever has been. And she also was the first person, I think, who understood the power of difference and the glamour of her own difference, mm-hmm. and used it so effectively. Mm-hmm. So I had a lot of time in all these years to think about Andy, think about Barbra, but the Barbra thing ended in a few years, but Andy, then we get into the Andy thing, so keep going. So that was the first iteration, was the Barbra, it was called the Jewish Jackie series. Right. And I knew I had to turn the screw a little on it because it looked cute, but I wanted to make sure it was as serious as I knew it really should be. Mm-hmm. And I had these words, my Elvis in my head. I mean, my titles generally come first, which is now they're the paintings, but mm-hmm. they generally came first. So I needed to find the right image of Yentl, but I found the right image of Yentl. And these are really, really big paintings, and they're based on Andy's Elvises. Right. Let's flip through. Okay, so we should hurry because I'm getting stuck. This is my grandma. So I did some celebrity portraits of people I really admired. I just put a couple in here.
So I want to ask you about audience awareness, because this treatment of your grandma in a New York art world context would be, at a first blush, it's Ileana Sonnabend, or it's some
I was trying
patron,
to make it, yeah,
right, and so.
Well, I was trying to make it like Mrs. Warhola.
Right.
But she did end up looking, that's what I always said, she ended up looking like Ileana Sonnabend. But I really was trying to make the Mrs. Warhola painting.
That makes perfect sense.
But let's flip. That's Elizabeth Murray.
Right, so when one thinks about the selection of the people that Warhol would have been using as models, Elvis, Troy Donahue, Liz, and patrons for, in a sense, subjects who pay to be subjects.
Right.
I want to be Warholized, right? This was the other thing, I make a living by making mm-hmm. images of people. You're now picking heroes, heroines, people you know, people you respect.
Yeah.
Slightly different sense of arrangement.
Yeah, and that's Cindy Sherman as Liza. And then I did a lot of self-portraits as Andy.
Right.
So this is called Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, and it's actually the second version of this. One of the art history paintings is also called Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man that has, I should have shown it, but I didn't. But it was sort of a real riff on David Sally. It had a male porno shot on the bottom from like a male porn store in the Village, and it had a Pollock thing on top, and then a big picture of Picasso's self-portrait, young. Right. That was called Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man. Right. So this is me as Andy, Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man.
Okay. Do we have the Christopher Makos piece in here?
Yes.
Okay.
And this is this was the last one of the entire series, and it was the first time I was posing as an Andy Warhol painting, but not as Andy. So it's me as Liz Taylor, but I thought that was a good way to get out. I know it's my last good idea. She is a nice Jewish lady, she was, and I thought this was a good way to go out.
Right. And what was the critical marketplace, however you want to judge it, reception of these things?
It was good. It was always good. But market, it was okay. What really got me was, 10 years later, 15 years later, Gavin Turk did it, and he did my work. I'm sure he didn't know my work, but he was, I don't know if he got the Turner Prize for it, but he was up for the Turner Prize, and it was like, I was never in a biennial. I mean, I was still marginalized. I mean, it did well. It supported me. I kept going with the work. It had a lot of writing about it.
And it positioned you critically as an artist of a certain stripe who is...
Yeah, and it's certainly been written about. In a lot of books. But I was never central to the New York art world because a woman painter just couldn't be.
Right. So let's talk about this image.
Let's talk about this image.
Because this image now, following the portrait of you as Andy as a young man, yes, starts to do some very
weird,
nimble gender bending.
Yeah.
So you want to talk a little bit about identification, sexuality, sense of self, and now like loading it up, because obviously you're layering several things at the same time.
Well, I always thought if you were, if you had like 3 or more identities, you got to get out of the ghetto, whatever ghetto that was, but you didn't. I didn't. Whatever the smallest ghetto in was always where I was put. But the reality is everything about my work is about, I hate to use the word the fluidity of identity, because A, I don't like the word identity, and B, it's so corny and such a cliche, but every bit of my work is about how complicated a human being is. So I could go on and on about the cross-dressing, except I'm just doing what Andy did.
Right.
Andy just put on a wig and looked a lot like Marlene Dietrich. I just put on a wig and I looked more like a drag queen than he ever looked. Whatever that means. And for whatever reason, it was bad makeup day. I don't know. It was very hot that day. I was sweating. I have a mustache in this because it was sweating through the white makeup on me. And this was pre-Photoshop.
Right.
So this was makeup, and sweating. And
But given your tendency to think of art history as a kind of store to play with, this would have been something that you not only were, in a sense, winking at the Andy history, but probably also, and we haven't talked about any of this ever, winking at Duchamp.
Oh, definitely.
And that history as well, right?
Well, definitely, because, I have paintings from college based on Duchamp.
Okay.
But that's part of my generation.
Right.
And that's part of Andy. If you're, I think every artist my age had to deal with Andy Warhol. And Andy Warhol had to deal with Marcel Duchamp. And we all had to deal with it. I was very invested in art history and very interested in it. And, I made a painting based on Rose C'est La Vie in college. I appropriated, Delacroix in college. I appropriated Jasper Johns in college. These tendencies, this is what I always did. I just got better at it. Partially because of what I read, and partially because I found a context outside of the art world and art history, which I find incredibly lacking in any kind of real politics and any kind of real, I have real issues with, I love art historians because they've been incredibly great to me, but art history as a discipline never pushed as hard as these nerdy girls in French literature pushed, and I don't know why, and it should have been more. But I think it's the market. I think that's why. So anyway, yeah, it's very complicated. It's very layered on layered on layered on layered.
But one part of, I think, what makes the work really successful on the terms of not only being objects, images that it is engaging to look at, but what you were talking about earlier about the physicality of them, the color, the palette, the richness of those things, one starts to be able to be aware that this is happening in a scale and with a sense of touch or lack of touch in some cases that the work demands in order for it to be understood as painting in the discourse that you're trying to.
Well, that comes into my later work a lot.
Right.
But I would also say one of the things that was, during my retrospective, the thing I was most scared about was Eric Shiner, who curated it, he contextualized a few rooms with Andy's paintings with my paintings. Uh-huh. And I work with Vincent Fremont as my manager, and Vincent Fremont was Andy's manager. And this was Vincent's idea to be my manager. And I knew that these celebrity portraits, and there are a lot more of them, more people, were going to be hanging with Andy's celebrity portraits. So in a room like this, there was 4 of mine, 4 of Andy's, 2 of mine, 2 of Andy's. And on another wall, 2 of mine and 2 of Andy's. And I was really worried that Vincent would think I didn't paint as well as Andy, because I have a really different hand. Mm-hmm. And when I tried to get painterly, I never could get painterly like Andy was painterly. I came to find out he used a sponge mop. But I didn't know that when I didn't know Vincent, and I didn't know how a lot of this stuff was done. I was just going like Sherry Levine from Reproductions. So it was very hard to know, like, even I'd look at them, I'd find them, and I'd stare at them, and I couldn't figure out how he did it. Well, 10 years later, I found out he did it with a sponge mop, but I didn't have a sponge mop. So I was really worried they weren't going to be painted well enough. But the fact is, when I got into this room, knowing my own work as well as I do, and knowing Andy Warhol's work almost as well as my work, I got confused looking at them. Like, they really look good, and they really look like Andy. So, the paint quality thing was always like a sort of thing in the back of my mind. And also I couldn't make myself do things like, there were some really ugly colors he used. Mm-hmm. And I couldn't make myself use them. Like, there were some tans. It's like, why would he use that ugly brownie tan? Like, I wouldn't do it. And I kind of couldn't make myself. So I had issues with painting. And the other thing is, I used a lot of I went a lot to the flat ones so I would avoid this issue.
Right.
And when I was painting the flat backgrounds, I got really good at painting completely flat backgrounds. And as I was painting them before I'd print, I would say, God, it looks like Ellsworth Kelly in here. And I got really obsessed with Ellsworth Kelly, which came out later, because I got so good at the flat painting. Anyway.
Okay,
Okay, so now we're to the newer paintings.
Okay. You're making all of these things yourself?
Yeah.
Which is a different.
Well, the Andy Warhols I had help.
Okay.
Screening.
Right, but you're applying, part of the tan palette, offhanded misregister stuff that we associate with Andy is always understood on some level as you decide, you pick colors, deferring to others to some degree.
I have to say something about all that. That's the other thing I couldn't get done. I couldn't get the funkiness in. I did when I could screen them myself. I could only screen things about this big, so the Barbers had a lot of funk and fuzz. But once I got bigger, I had to go to a real people, because it would be 2 guys on the side of one big squeegee. It's not. I'm incapable of doing that, and I really couldn't get them to screw stuff up. And then at one point, I did get them when I did the Debs, the Lizzes, the Debs. I tried them on paper first, and I got them to do funky stuff, just to try. Like we got a lot of chatter and a lot of messy stuff, like streaky stuff. But I found out when I did that actually, even though they looked more like Andy's in a certain way, the funkiness, they look less like Andy. They read less like Andy. It was confusing. So at that point, I felt better that they were more pristine because you remember them differently. It's the Sherry Levine thing. It's like she painted the reproductions of El Lissitzky's.
Right.
And it's how most of us know El Lissitzky. Most of us know Andy's from the reproductions. There was something about the cleaner they were, the more they actually did look like Andy Warhols, the more confusing they were. I'm sorry, that's a little technical, but that was
but
kind of...
But I mean, one of the things that I think is often interesting for how artists and their work get understood are incredibly small differences between how's the thing applied, what's its immediate fast take, what does it look like at 20 feet versus 2 inches. I mean, all of those things matter significantly.
I was really surprised that these streaky, funky Debs didn't work. Right. I really thought that was the ticket. I thought that's what I was going to make. Okay, so
let's talk a little bit about...
So these were the feel-good paintings for feel-bad times. Right. And that wasn't a show I was in. That's the name of this body of work. Right. And basically, they started right after I got done with Andy. And I spent a year drawing, not knowing what I was going to be doing, really. I mean, I was doing, this is a drawing I did. This should be the painting, but that's what the watercolors look like. Right. That these things started as.
And so we were talking earlier about this idea of audience and how much you imagine on some levels the ideal audience knows. So if people are looking at this painting, they may know about Kenneth Noland. They may also know about Patrick Swayze and Jennifer Grey. And so how much do you assume the audience knows, or how much would you like them to know at the moment of viewing?
Well, the more you know, the better things are. And if you don't know anything, they should look good. And maybe someone will tell you later, oh, that's really from Dirty Dancing, right, which was my most favorite, most embarrassing movie, which I've seen 1,000,000 times. I think every Jewish woman in New York has seen that movie 1,000 times. And, nobody puts baby in the corner is the big moment in the movie. But talking about intertextuality, this is it. So, so these paintings were much more about turning 50 and wanting to paint again and thinking about the 70s and all those women painters I love so much. And there was a lot of language used at that time in those paintings.
Sure.
And I just sort of wanted to go back to my canon that I loved, my post-war formalist or modernist canon at MoMA that I grew up on and that I fell in love with, and do it from my perspective.
So I wanted to ask you about spending time at MoMA. I mean, as a kid in New York, I spent a lot of time at MoMA, at the Met, but you were talking a little bit earlier about spending time at the Carnegie.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering whether you will talk a little bit about your interactions as a young viewer with art history, live art history, not books, but being at a museum, looking at work.
Well, there were kind of two periods. There was high school, and then there was college. And I grew up in Long Island, so I was like on the Long Island Railroad, coming into town on Saturdays to take drawing classes at the Art Students League. And then in the afternoon, I'd go to MoMA or the Met or the theater. And this was all done on my own money. My parents did not approve of any of this. This was babysitting money. And I sort of had a very brief moment in high school. I always wanted to be an artist, but I had this little moment where I thought maybe I wanted to do theater. And so I started going to a lot of theater. So when I wasn't sneaking into the second act of MAME, because I knew when the curtain was, and I could go see it, I saw the second act like 5 times. because it happened to be, Auntie Mame happened to be a very formative movie for me in first grade. Or was it first grade? Yeah, first or second. And I saw this movie and it like changed my life, and I had to like go tell my teacher about this movie. So when they made a musical, I had to see the musical. But I was also like going to off-Broadway stuff, and you know, I was going to a lot of theater. And I was going to MoMA all the time, and the Met sometimes, but really MoMA. And I really had no clue what I was looking at. I just kept going, and I kept going to the bookstore. And I just see that Calvin Tompkins' Bride Stripped Bare is reissued. And that book was so important to me. When I was 16 or 17, I don't even have words, because it explains so much to me, that particular book.
Right. Did you think that the artist, in quotes, was a performer at heart?
I didn't know what I thought. I thought it was a man.
Okay.
I thought the artist was always a man.
Okay.
And I thought, I have no idea what any of this has to do with me.
Okay.
But I'm finding myself falling madly in love with Cézanne. And I'm finding myself, and my big revelation was Frank Stella. So when the Frank Stella retrospective was at MoMA, I was in high school. And there was also an Eva Hesse show at the Guggenheim at some point that really rocked my world, because she was a girl.
Right.
And because I really got that work. But Stella was my first modern artist that I actually knew what he was doing. And I wrote very intensely and insightfully in my little diary, sitting at the cafe at MoMA, about that show that day. Because I got what he was doing with the support, with the whole inside and outside of the content and the form being the same thing. And it's all there in my writing, my scribble. And I was completely thrilled. I understood how he got from one painting to the next. And I literally thought if I could figure out this guy's thinking, I could do this. I mean, I was already going to go to Carnegie Mellon. I already got into art school. I was already going to be a painter, but I was really not sure. And it was this show that I understood his thinking that I really, like, the whole world opened up. And it also explains my complete, total falling in love with Elizabeth Murray when she broke out from Frank Stella.
Sure.
I totally understood exactly. You know, she had all the same influences, Cézanne, de Kooning, Stella, and when she broke out of that rectangle, it was like magic to me.
Right.
And I got it. That was like 10 years, it was less than 10 years later, it was 6 years later.
Let's move into a couple of these.
You can keep going.
I love, one of the things that I think for people who know things I've shown here is I'm a fan of self-aware objects, objects that seem to be able to sort of be, I'll borrow a phrase, doing a double consciousness, right? A phrase that is like, I know that you know that I know, kind of.
It's also the
mindset.
Barbara Kruger thing.
Right.
Which is you know.
We, you, me, they.
Yeah. So in this work, I really wanted to talk very much about my generation, because I think you asked me before about young artists and what young artists can take from my work. And all I can say, and I thought it when you asked me, is you have to talk about yourself. You have to talk about your own context. You have to talk about your generation. You have to talk about big things. Whatever is on your mind. Now I think the bigger the better. You know, the context is everything. So I really wanted to make work about my generation. I really wanted to make work about how being pushed aside one's whole life, being an artist feels like, emotionally. The other stuff was more, it was very like almost structural. I wanted these to be emotional. And it was like a real conscious decision. Like, I'm going to make paintings. They're going to be paintings again. I'm going to use my hand, and I'm going to use color, and I'm going to talk about what I love, which is post-war painting, and I'm going to talk about being marginal. And I'm going to talk about how it feels. Not how I got marginal. Not how I've been uninscribed or reinscribed or everyone, how do I look or anything else. Just what it feels like. And So my references, like this is disco, it's from the 70s, it's Sylvester, who was a great drag queen, and also Sandra Bernhard used him and used this in her movie and in her play Without You I'm Nothing, which was like a real touch point for me in 1989. So there's a few Sylvester references and disco, and then I also wanted to talk about what I think is great, what was great about post-war America that was no longer great about post-war America. And this was all actually a response to George Bush. On top of it, turning 50, this was about George Bush. This was about corruption. This was about exploitation. This was about war. This was about every single thing I say, almost everything I say in these paintings can be taken in at least two ways. Thus, they're called feel-good paintings for feel-bad times. So they were really coming out of a political situation that was, I thought, and I still feel, so incredibly despairing. Like, how do you handle it? Okay. So it's like more than just being marginalized. It's these other big things.
Well,
too.
it's interesting. You say, in a sense, when you're talking like structural analysis, you went image. Emotional response, you went language.
Totally. Chaka.
Right. But again, I love that the reference may very well be to something outside of the painting, to the painting itself, to the notion of like desire to look at the object, to want the object. I mean, all of this is possible in there.
There's this other thing too that's, like I said, I hate the word identity because it's so ridiculously limiting and it's so limited me, ridiculously. And I say that because, well, because it's true. That I think, I've said this a lot and I truly believe it. Identity is a noun. Identity is what you are. Identity is how you're born. Identity is what you're stuck with. But when I was a kid and when you're a little kid, and this is also about young people and what they can take, to me what's interesting is identification. It's identifying. It's going through the world going, that lyric has something to do with me. That color has something to do with me. That painting, I don't know what. But that girl with the nose named Barbra Streisand has something to do with me. I can't say why, I don't know, whatever. I identify with this person. I identified with Rosalind Russell as Auntie Mame. I was 6, and I don't know why I did, but I did. And I took this character to heart because I felt compelled by this person. So I felt compelled by objects at MoMA. They had something to do with me, I don't know what. I identified with things and images, and then these people, and then these words. And when you put together a bunch of identifications, you start figuring out who you are in the world. And that, to me, is a way more interesting thing than identity, which I think is a total snooze. Next. Okay, so this is actually, there's 3 paintings in a row, and these 3 paintings in a row are the Barbra Streisand and Judy Garland duet from 1962 on the Judy Garland show.
Do we have the other 2?
Oh, they're all in there.
Okay.
Happy Days Are Here Again. This one is really, this thing says it all. I'm doing this really big now on metal, because like, this is where I want to be.
Right.
Yeah. So they never got installed because it actually didn't work on the wall, but this is how I made these 3 paintings.
Is it fun to paint language? Is there something?
It's fun to paint.
It's fun to paint.
It's just fun to paint. Okay, this says, Daddy, I would love to dance, twice. And it's called Frank's Dilemma, after Frank Stella's Jasper's Dilemma.
Right.
And this line is from Chorus Line, which had I been less of a snob when I was 23, I should have seen, because I was exactly the same age as the kids on the line when this show opened that took Broadway by storm, but I was too much of a downtown art snob to think about Broadway at all. Because, I was cool. So I would never have seen this show. So I saw this show the month it was closing, after it was on Broadway for 20 years, and I was now 43. And I went to see Chorus Line like the last person in the world. So I think I saw it 3 times that month. And by the time I went to see Chorus Line, it was nothing but nostalgic for me because I remembered being that age in New York and being just like those kids on the line, except I was waitressing at Broome Street Bar, and I wanted to be an artist. And I couldn't believe I missed it because it was so like everyone aspirational I knew in their early 20s in Tribeca and Soho in the 70s when the city was a mess and we were all there together in the beginning. And Daddy, I Would Love to Dance is the first emotional female epiphany when the song is cut 3. Everything was beautiful at the ballet, and it's all the girls talking about why they became dancers. And this line is, I used to dance around the living room, and he would say, Maggie, do you want to dance? And I would say, Daddy, I would love to dance. It's such a heart-rending moment in the show. So that's what this painting, I made a lot of these paintings, but this is the best one. It's the biggest.
And even though you're saying it obviously connects to, Stella, it also connects to Jasper, it also connects to Chorus Line, it also connects to camouflage on some level or another. And
Totally,
so you're
yeah.
getting back to another kind of...
And talk about trippy. This is one trippy painting. So this is from Ed Ruscha's Oof. And I did it, and then a friend saw the reflection in the Casman window, and do the next one. And she said, and it said, yo. I said, should I make the painting? She said, yeah. So now this is like, this whole oi yo thing has become like a brand. So I have shoes, like Belgian slippers, the fancy slippers.
Yeah, I've seen them actually.
One says oi and one says yo, and we're making a carry necklace, a name necklace. So you can wear oi or yo depending on how you feel. And then this led to a couple other things. The sculpture, which you can read either way. Next one is the other way. So it depends on your mood. And then that led to that. Oh God, can you even read this? This is enough already made into a neon. So now I'm doing some sculptures based on these paintings.
So I want to get back to something we talked about, kind of at lunch, which is entertainment and the relationship that I think many artists now kind of feel in the way that information travels, the way that popularity happens, the way that the market and its presence is felt by a lot of folks. You mentioned, Hollywood, you mentioned Broadway, you mentioned a lot of things that were unabashedly made to entertain people, but in a way that was not a slight on seriousness. You know what I mean? Like, really great Broadway, really great Hollywood doesn't necessarily make oppositional the desire to entertain and the desire to be rigorous and really smart.
Stephen Sondheim comes to mind.
Okay, so you want to talk a little bit about your relationship to somebody like, or that specific person, Stephen Sondheim?
Well,
What do you
why
know?
don't we find one of the
Okay.
Sondheims,
Okay,
for instance?
yeah.
Well, I guess I would just say that I used these things the way I use these painters. And all of these places are to be mined for meaning. They all have meaning. They all create meaning. They all create value. So, in as much as entertainment is a text that has meaning and makes meaning, I think it should be questioned and used, same way as everything else. So, my reason for using Broadway in the movies had something to also do with ethnicity, and it also had to do with a bunch of New York Jews. It is also on top of being connected to stuff. Well, I want to backtrack. The greatest thing America ever did was its culture. The greatest export it ever had was its culture. It was its movies, it was Motown, it was jazz, it was Broadway. these are the only things left that these are the best things about us. And they were all mostly post-war inventions, post-war painting. And when I was going through the Bush years in complete despair, I was trying to remember better times and why they were better and what they were about. And in as much as entertainment figures into those things, I could use it. But it was a reflection and a meditation on those things. It wasn't just like, yeah, let's put on a show. You know, it's more like there was a time we had something to say. There was also a time we had something to give the world, really, and it was culture. It's exactly the thing that has been starved out,
Right.
you know, and
the thing that is often, you know, kind of unfunded, uncared for,
Right.
Declared as important, because I
Right.
think what you said is exactly right. Those cultural productions, those senses of multi-voiced, multi-historied, not just the wealthy, like a range of diverse Americans
Absolutely.
of all
And-
stripes, making things that actually spoke to very complicated, very joyful, very real things.
Rodgers and Hammerstein were obsessed with social justice, intermarriage. You know, these were radical things on Broadway in South Pacific, you know,
right.
and they always took on serious subjects. Class, Lerner and Loewe, My Fair Lady. I know it's George Bernard Shaw, but you know, there were these things. They were always entertaining, and there was always not always, but often a serious thread. And it's a cultural history that hasn't really been written yet. The closest person to me, I think, is Ryan Murphy, who does Glee. And when Glee started on TV, I went absolutely bullshit crazy because he's obsessed with Barbra Streisand. Barbra Streisand structured that show. He's obsessed with Stephen Sondheim. He's obsessed with musicals. It's like, this is a really serious subject that has really far-reaching implications if anyone took it seriously. And there are scholars of this stuff now.
And he's obsessed with a moment in high school when you were supposed to figure out or try to who
With
you are.
outsiders. He's
Right,
obsessed
right.
with the gay kid, the Jewish girl with two dads, and, you know, Fat Mercedes. I mean, it's a really interesting construction. And, you know, I've been like pushing my gallery for 7 years. You have to get in touch with Ryan Murphy. I got close. Brad Gray bought a bunch of stuff, but it's not Ryan Murphy. You know, he's like my hero. And, you know, it's a huge, interesting history. And I think it's amazing that Ryan Murphy made a TV show that was this successful about nerdy show queens. And a whole new generation actually knows who Stephen Sondheim is because of Ryan Murphy. They actually know who Barbra Streisand is because of Ryan Murphy. And these are really culturally important people.
Right.
You know, it's really, and I think that post-war optimism and that post-war middle class that produced all of this great art in Detroit, in New York, in LA, it's a product of a middle class. And it's the thing that was also being destroyed consciously during Bush. And I write all my own press releases. And if you read them from 2007 on, it is all about the destruction of the middle class and the great cultural production that the middle class was responsible for. And I would also like to say that almost every artist my age came from a New York suburb. Like, name them. We all came from Jersey, Connecticut, and New York. Most of us. Not all of us, or LA. Most of us. We could not have been more embarrassed I could not have been more embarrassed about being from Long Island. It was like a shanda. It was just like so embarrassing to be from the suburbs. To me now, it's like the golden age. For all the misogyny, homophobia, and racism, what came out of it was amazing. You know? So it's this reverse snobbery thing also. It's why I wouldn't see Chorus Line at 23 when I should have seen Chorus Line, because like, who would go to the who would see a Broadway musical?
Well, there's something about also sort of getting older and feeling permission to like what you like unabashedly, you know, or liking things that are not cool.
I really became much more of a Broadway baby when I was older. It was really, you know, I was busy with Bob Dylan and the Stones,
right.
you know, and the band. And this is, okay, day after day after day after day, which comes from the great Sondheim, Not a Day Goes By from a bad show, Merrily We Roll Along, which I don't like at all, but it's a great, great song. Wait, go back. And this was done during the BP oil spill. And this is 21 feet, and it's 7 days. And it's kind of my favorite painting. That's why I wanted to stay on it a little. And I just love this painting. I find it like, it was in they did a Surviving Sandy show, that Fong Bui show,
Right.
and this was in, so it had this whole other resonance
Sure.
about hurricane. Okay, you can go on.
Well, but I mean, it is also back to this idea that these things have multiple
Yeah,
places from which they can speak and multiple subjects which they can address, regardless of the thing
and
that
multiple
prompted them.
subjectivities that they're
Right.
coming from.
Right.
And this says, this is called After Louise Bourgeois, and it's a takeoff on a quote. And mine says, a woman has no place in the, well, hers says, a woman has no place as an artist unless she proves over and over again she won't be eliminated. And I thought that was an incredibly unfair thing for her to say. Because why do we have to prove over and over again we won't be eliminated? So I made it the art world. So it says, a woman has no place in the art world unless she can prove over and over again. Because that's a political situation.
Right.
You are an artist. It's not a political choice.
Right.
And it's neon.
Done.
And I think we're done. I think that's it.
Okay. I think I could go on, but I would be remiss to not sort of open it up to others. So I do want to do a little time check here and see where we're
It's
at.
10
Where
of,
are
we just did an hour.
Okay.
Exactly.
It's 10 after.
No, it's enough.
10 up. Okay, awesome. So questions by anybody who is with us? Don't make me call people. There's some really good people here who I could call.
There's somebody.
Did you get any reactions from the artists who appropriated?
Yes. No. Let's just put it this way. Then I only started using dead people. Then there were no reactions. There were only reactions from the Andy people. And everyone who walked into my studio, it was the greatest. I had 3 people say, art historians say the exact same thing. Andy would have loved this. And Andy would have loved this. Andy was a generous man. Mm-hmm. The live people were not so generous.
Yeah.
I don't know if you went over it, but you was talking about the before and after the event. Did that have a specific meaning, like as far as before? Was there a certain point you were trying to iterate?
Well, that image, the nose job image, was from an Andy Warhol painting, if that's what you're asking. So Andy Warhol made that painting, and Andy Warhol's came from an ad. Those were like old-fashioned ads for nose jobs. So in the 60s, if you open the Daily News in New York or any local paper, you'd see that ad. And Andy appropriated it. And I just coupled it with the Cinderella thing and decided that it was actually about Jewish princesses, which I hadn't planned on. I just thought it was a feminist thing. Like you change yourself, you get the man kind of thing. Does that answer your question? Okay.
Could you say some more about the choice to put the Dirty Dancing quote on the Nolan? It seems to me that you're drawing attention to the way that can be read as content, the image, his targets. I mean, it seems very sexualized.
Really?
Yeah.
What's sexual about it?
Well, maybe I'm reading him through Judy Chicago, but it starts to look like a nipple.
I never thought about that. Which is not to say it doesn't look like a nipple. It's just I never thought about that. But now that you mentioned it, I never thought about it. I thought it looked like a Ken Nolan. You know, I think he made those paintings around the time that movie's supposed to be. The early 60s. Like as things were changing.
There's also a funny flip on, nobody puts baby in a corner.
And there's a circle.
And it's so,
That's more what I was going
right,
after.
Right,
You know, that's why I used it, because
Right.
it was a circle.
right.
and Ken Nolan was the circle man.
Which is back to the Stella argument, which is what's so smart about that whole image support thing, which is what Frank talks about when he says, it's like, what do you do with the corners?
Right.
The way that the way
That's
that,
right.
That's
Yeah.
the way of getting out of the corner, is by
Right.
making the corner
You get rid of the
relational
corner.
to the rest of it.
I know, and I had to really think about, did I want it on a square painting? And I did. So there were corners. But that's not where Baby was. Baby
Right.
was out of the corner.
Right. I might have gotten a little familiar calling him Frank, but anyway, others? Catherine?
So you talked about the surfaces of the Warhol project paintings, and I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about the surfaces of the newer paintings. Are they similar?
You know, they're all a little different. So it really depends on the painting. Like those, like that, Do You Want a Funk is on this really, really shiny, shiny, shiny black enamel. I tend to mix oil and acrylic. I mean, I don't mix them physically. You know, I tend to use both so that there's some kind of variation. So, and if Ken Nolan's looked a certain way, mine's going to look a certain way. And if Frank's looks a certain way, mine's going to look that way too. So it's pretty determined by who I'm using. And they're kind of different when you see them than when you see them here. Yeah. 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 I mean, there's a lot of palette knife stuff, believe it or not, in those letters. They're like ladled on sometimes with they're really thick oil. On Day After Day, it's acrylic in the back, and then the letters are in like straight out of the tube. No, nothing added to it, but I try to get the exact same color. You know, I mix them to get as close as I possibly can. So there's a real difference between the foreground and the letters. But from other angles, they disappear. So it just depends.
Romy?
I was thinking a lot about what you said about how, I guess now at this stage, you've almost allowed yourself to like certain things or have more popular culture, what have you. And do you think any of that could have to do with just the way we see information now is almost all on the same level? You know, you'll be surfing the internet in the same sentence of hearing about Miley Cyrus and what's going on in Syria.
This was always my life. This is pre-internet. You know, I've always seen it pretty. If you grew up with Andy Warhol, you pretty much see things that way. If Andy Warhol was your guy in the 60s, it was or Jasper Johns or Rauschenberg. I mean, if you're in any way invested in pop or grew up with pop, that's what pop was about. Lichtenstein. It was literally about taking popular culture and making high art out of it. So before the internet, there was Andy Warhol, there was Roy Lichtenstein, there was Rosalind Drexler. You know, there were other people doing this. And you know, this is where the world does catch up with artists in a certain way, you know, but that's what pop was. So I would say in my generation, I think, I shouldn't talk for my generation. For me, growing up with popular music as sort of like the soundtrack, my mother's movies on TV, Carol Burnett, you know, the stuff I thought was great, Lucille Ball. The stuff I grew up on was TV. I grew up on TV. I guess that's it. It's TV. And I think in the Pictures Generation show at the Met, they said we were the first people to grow up with TV, which is even hard for me to imagine being the first generation of anything, but I guess we were. So I grew up looking at cartoons and reading Mad Magazine and Bugs Bunny and Gerald McBoing Boing and, you know, like Hanna-Barbera and Fred Flintstone. And this was great art. To me, great art, my first great artist was Charles Schulz. It was Peanuts. That was my first visual artist I completely consumed and wrote fan letters to and sent drawings to. So, you know, to me, it's been pretty much the same. And like I said, it's another site of meaning. It's another site to go, well, what has the culture produced and what does that mean? And what does it have to do with me? What does it have to do with women? And what is it, like, what has it made us into? How has it made us? How has art history made us?
It's also, how is it reaching us? Because art history is one thing, but Norman Lear on television, and Maude and All in the Family, and Mary Tyler Moore and Carol Burnett and all those people. I mean, like, that was reaching a mass audience who could then talk about it.
And to be honest, I really think popular culture is way ahead of art. I think that there's, if it's popular, it means it's popular. And if it's on TV, it means because it's selling enough to stay on TV. And if it's selling enough, it means a lot of people are into it and getting it. And I think that, frankly, there's more progressive politics in popular culture than there is in art. There just is. I mean, I find art, it's the only thing that gives me pause, is that it is so retrogressive. It is so, and that's why I said we should talk about values.
Yeah, I was going to go there if you didn't. But this is the good.
Like, the values of the art world are, in my humble opinion, terrible. I'd much rather watch Glee. I'd much rather see Glee. I'd 5,000 times rather watch TV and Scandal and Glee and Game of Thrones and, then walk around Chelsea where I'm just still looking at young men painting being expensive, and getting places that women just can't get no matter who the hell they are. And I just finished this book everyone should read called The Blazing Worlds by Siri Husfeld. And it's about an older woman artist. And it's so brilliant. I'm buzzed out on this book. Anyway, I think everything is more progressive than the art world. The art world is just a shitty market.
So how does, because I don't know who would disagree with you on some levels. I know a lot of people who would, but so how does one stay buoyant, let's use that word, in the context that you work in the context that we all are, we're here, what keeps one optimistic to continue working in a setting that you can say what you just said about?
Optimism has nothing to do with it.
Okay.
It is an absolute need. You shouldn't do it if you don't need to do it, because it's sort of like, I'm the most pessimistic person I know, except my brother, who's a short seller. It really runs in the family. We are really doom and gloom. I think the world's coming to an end. And, I know it's coming. I'm sure it's coming to an end. Stop laughing.
Day after day after day, stop.
I don't, I have no choice, and this is the question. The question forget the art world. The question looming is the obvious. We have shat where we ate for so long that the planet's totally hostile, polluted, destroyed. Fukushima, BP, it's over, kids. I think it's over. So how do you live? So it's perfect to be a painter and a woman painter.
Who loves Broadway?
Who loves Broadway? Why not? Why not? It's like, it's a complete analogous situation, so why not get into it and I'm not going to figure it out for the world.
Right.
I'm just trying to figure out how to sort of maybe have a little bit of a better time before it's up.
So the moral here is everybody go home, find your bliss,
Smoke some weed,
find the thing that makes you happy.
watch Scandal,
Okay.
pretend we're Olivia Pope.
I think we should end there. I think there's nowhere else we should probably go. I want to thank Deborah Kass for an awesome conversation. Thank you all for being here, and continue to follow the talks that are in this series. On May 17th, David Platzker from MoMA will be here talking about his history at Printed Matter, and is a great champion of book arts and ephemera. And so just thank you all for being here. Great pleasure.